My name's Richard Dolan. I've been researching the UFO topic now for about 15 years, since the early mid-1990s. Back in those days, I kind of stumbled into the topic through my work as a graduate student in history. I had been doing Cold War studies, Harry Truman, the Soviet Union, the birth of the CIA, and all of those items, and was in a bookstore, found a UFO conspiracy book, rather well-known book called Above Top Secret by the author Timothy Good. The subtitle was The Worldwide UFO Cover-Up, and I thought, oh, well, that's interesting, big fat book. I remember going through the book and recognizing many of the names that he had indicated in there, and a lot of the departments and so on, and I thought, well, that's interesting, because I'd read about a lot of this, but not in a UFO context. And I was intrigued. I wanted to know, is there something to this? If so, why had I never read about any of it in an academic context before? And so that was the bug that got in my ear initially. I bought the book and I started doing additional research on the UFO topic, and very soon became almost, you could say, obsessed. I really wanted to find out for myself personally, was this something that it was important? Not initially, were UFOs even real, or were they alien? I wasn't really at that point yet. I was at a much more conservative point at that time, which was simply, is this a genuine topic worthy of historical study? And I very quickly came to the conclusion that it was. You know, my stock in trade has always been trying to understand documents, government documents, military documents. And in the UFO field, there's a good number of very good documents that may not be a single smoking gun by themselves. There's no confirmed document that's like a memo from the president describing aliens. But what I discovered in my attempt to understand this was that there were many documents that were one cut below that, that described, for instance, violations of sensitive airspace by objects that, frankly, you know, as described in these documents, should not have existed. Disc-shaped, stopping on a dime, taking off like a bullet, zigzagging sometimes. Memos describing these objects in very serious terms. Attempted interceptions being made, radar trackings, and so forth. And I thought, well, that's interesting. No matter what the answer to the UFO mystery is, the fact that these documents exist and the fact that they get no attention in our mainstream community, academic, journalistic, whatever, that's a discrepancy. And so that's always been the foundation of where I'm coming at in this field. No matter what else I may research, no matter what else I may think about this, if I'm dealing with someone who's very skeptical, who wants to know what's the big deal, the one thing that I can always come back to is that we've got this substantial discrepancy between what we officially know, what our official truth is as a society, and then what we know is going on in the UFO field regarding the military encounters. So that got me started. That was in the early, mid-1990s. The research that I undertook, all of which started out as a purely personal endeavor, morphed into a 500-page book that I wrote. And that book is called U.F.O.s and the National Security State. And in fact, writing that book, it was completed, the first edition was completed in mid-2000. That was my education in this field. I mean, researching it and writing it really, by the time I got to the end of that project, got me to the point where I felt that, all right, now I know a few things about this subject. Now that historical narrative, it's very, very much a straightforward historical analysis of the UFO phenomenon, but even more than that, it's actually a reinterpretation of American history and even of world history with the UFO phenomenon front row center. So it's not just a UFO book. It's really, it's a more ambitious attempt, if I may say. It's an attempt to rewrite our history in a way that makes sense with this phenomenon inserted into it. Now that history ended in the year 1973. That's when that volume ended. And I, certainly remember when that book came out, I had readers who said, wow, yeah, it's a pretty good book. What about the rest of the story now? And I thought, well, right, so I've got to do that. The problem that I had was, again, needing to get up to speed on all the research, and that's taken a long time. But I've done it. Initially, I was going to write simply a 2-volume history of this, so volume 1 and then volume 2, but in fact I've decided it's going to be a 3-volume effort. It really has to be. So this second volume is finished. It'll be released within less than 30 days from now. The second volume of UFOs in the National Security State, I've subtitled it The Cover-Up Exposed, and that covers the years 1973 to 1991, the end of the Cold War, in other words, the collapse of the Soviet Union. This is a slightly longer book than the first one that I wrote. Similar. The approach is not radically different. Again, it's a straightforward historical analysis that really relies on 3 major strands going into it. So the first strand is essentially a kind of a concise compendium of the important UFO stories of that period of time. Whether it's something like the Travis Walton abduction case or the Rendlesham Forest case of 1980 when a UFO landed near an American air base in Britain, or the introduction of Bob Lazar into the field of ufology, or any number of other things. The first strand of this book deals with each of those topics in a complete but concise way. So almost like an encyclopedia, you might think, oh, what does Dolan's book have to say about Lazar? And you could read, or Gulf Breeze, or whatever. The second strand of the book is what I would call a geopolitical analysis. So it's an attempt to understand the cover-up, understand who's in charge, how does this whole thing fit together, who's running the show? Is it the president? Well, if it isn't the president, then who would it be? Along those lines, I try to understand the nature of the military and intelligence community's interest in UFOs. And in this book, not simply of the United States. What I've been fortunate about is that for the 1970s and 80s, what we find is that there's a greater amount of source material available from other nations. And so, whereas you can still really get the most detail from the American side of it still, there's a much greater amount of data now during those years coming from Britain, France, Soviet Union, Australia, China. All right, information that really was not so much available in the early years of this, the 1940s and 50s. So this second book deals with more of a broad global view. So that's the geopolitics side. And then there's a third strand that goes into this book that I've just written, and that's, let's call it the history of ufology or of UFO research. That is, the attempts of researchers in this field to understand what is going on. What that turned out personally to be maybe the most fascinating part of the book for me to do. What we find is that in the early 1970s, researchers were in a certain place with this in terms of what they thought, and by the time they get to 1991, just 18 years later, they were in a very, very different place. And so the story of how you get from here to there is also fascinating. And I don't believe it's ever really been done as a history before. There's been some very good articles about ufology, certainly, but to my knowledge, not a single kind of coherent analysis of how ufology moved along during those years. So that's really it, and those are the 3 strands that I tried to, as it were, weave together. I'll leave it to readers to decide how successful that attempt was, but this field demands a good history, and there really, in my view, there hadn't been one that was satisfactory, that really handled this topic the way it ought to be, and I tried to give it as comprehensive an effort as I could do. There are many issues on the topic of UFOs that no one's really going to know for sure. But here's something that you can take to the bank. UFOs are real. They're absolutely real. And we know this. We have an overwhelming abundance of data, of documentation that prove, beyond a shadow of a doubt, that there are objects existing that aren't supposed to exist. Officially, in our world, they're not supposed to exist. Whether they're saucer-shaped, triangles, or who knows what other kinds of permutations they may have. Rectangles. These things that can hover in the sky, silently, take off, often rapidly. These are using principles of aviation or flight that are not in the official books today. But someone has got some answers on this because they're doing something there. So that's something you can take to the bank. UFOs are real. Now here's the real question. Are they alien? Now, in my early years of researching this, after I became persuaded that the phenomenon was real, I took it as a given that, well, it had to be alien. It had to be. I mean, because I didn't see the technological breakthroughs during the 1940s and 50s that would have been necessary to get us to that level. Today, I have a little more of a nuanced view of this. I do think that a large number of the true UFOs are not of our civilization. Let's call them alien. But I also believe, I've also come to understand that there's been a great deal of work that was done in the 40s, in Nazi Germany, for instance, and in the United States after the war, that was much more advanced, much more exotic than I had understood at the time. So the question is, are there man-made UFOs? And I think the answer to that is also yes. I think that part of the secret, in fact, is that we're making our own UFOs. Now that begs another question. If we're making UFOs, well, where the heck are these things? Why are they not officially in any U.S. military arsenal? Why are they not being used in any of the wars that we're currently fighting, where you can assume surely they would come in very handy? It's a fair question. My answer to that, provisional answer, is that they're considered too important to use in mere conventional wars. Their mission, I believe, is to go off-world, to deal with them, whoever they happen to be. Perfect example is if you go back in history, you go back to the 1986 bombing of Libya by the United States. The U.S. bombed Libya at that time using F-111 fighter jets. Now, it's interesting because at the time, the United States had operational a certain number of F-117 stealth fighters, which had been flying since the early 1980s. They would have done a better job. They might have actually killed Muammar Gaddafi, which the F-111s didn't do. Who knows? But they weren't used. So the question is, well, why not use your best fighter weapon for a mission like that? And the answer, in the official military history, is that the F-117, whose existence was still classified at that time, was considered too important to risk its exposure for that mission. Okay, so that gives you an idea of the mindset. You can have a totally operational technology, but you would still withhold it for a whole range of missions, and you might only authorize it for certain missions for which it has been designed. And I believe that this is the case with America's fleet, or somebody's fleet, of, let's call them, flying saucers. Their mission is considered too important for them to risk compromising and giving up their existence for mere wars in Iran, Iraq, or Afghanistan. So that's the secret. One thing that I'm often confronted with by people who find out that I'm this UFO guy, and then they think, oh, wow, well, that's interesting, UFOs. I've always wondered about them. What I find in dealing with the general public is that there's a lot of general interest on the topic of UFOs. A lot of people have some interest in it. What I often find, though, is that the interest is kind of light. It's like, gee, UFOs are fun. Let's learn a little bit more about them. It's that kind of thing. And I think about a lot of things relating to UFOs, but fun doesn't really enter into my picture of them. What I would suggest for people to understand is that this is very probably the single most serious issue of our civilization. That is the existence of some other intelligence that is interacting with humanity right now. That's very important. People may think, well, what does that have to do with me? I go through my life, I've got my job, I've got my family, I've got my stuff to do. Even if they're real, even if they're walking around, even if the president is an alien, how does that really affect my life? Well, here's what I would say. Everyone has their own choice to sleep or wake. You can choose to sleepwalk your whole life away if you want. You want to grow up with a certain set of things that you are told are true, what some people might call your little reality box, and if you want to live in that box, and many people do, that's their choice. But it isn't everybody's choice. And so if you get to the point in your life where you feel that there's something wrong with the way I'm understanding the world, I'm going to suggest that this topic is one key part of the answer. That the UFO reality, and this is what I discovered in my own research. I got into this 15 years ago almost on a lark, thinking, well, that's an interesting topic. I want to know for personal reasons what this is all about. And what I discovered is that once you pry that topic open, it opens up a whole range of other related topics about the nature of this world. For example, I thought, well, if this reality is so big and so profound, where's the mainstream media? Why haven't they covered this? Where's our political system? Where's our academic system? And that led me into a study of all of those institutions and their relationship to what I call the national security state. It led me, in other words, into a complete reevaluation of my whole society, of this whole civilization. Not everyone cares, but some of us do. And so if you're someone who does care, I'm going to suggest to you that the UFO topic is very much worth your time to investigate. When we ask who's running the cover-up, I have to be the first to say that I don't have the final word on this. All I can do is think about it and try to do the best kind of speculation and intelligent guesswork as I can. So here's what I would say. Forget UFOs for a moment, and let's just look at the broad world of geopolitics, and let's look at the office of the U.S. president. And we ask ourselves, how much decision-making power does an American president have? For example, if you want to study the administration of, say, Ronald Reagan, okay? He covers 8 important years in the history of this new book of mine. What we find is that Ronald Reagan did very, very little actual management of the office of the president. Keep in mind, he was elected at the age of 70. There was an assassination attempt on him 2 months into his office. What historians now are recognizing is that most of Reagan's presidency was managed by George Bush, vice president, CIA director William Casey, a couple of other people who were close up there, like Donald Reagan, his chief of staff, and a few others. So that, in other words, Ronald Reagan was, no matter what you think of the man personally, okay, was really a guy who was reading the cue cards. And his job was to do what his staff guided him to do. So who's guiding the staff? Who do they work for? Well, what we find is that, as always with American politics, there's money behind the scenes. And the money determines broad geopolitical decisions, whether it's to rig elections in Iran in the 1950s, or overthrow that elected government, or to have coups in Guatemala, or whether it's to invade the nation of Iraq in 1991 during the Gulf War. All of these decisions have their roots in finance and money. And this is what we find. So, for example, are there international groups? Are there the nefarious Bilderberg group that helps to manage things behind the scenes? Well, the answer is absolutely yes, they do. In the study of this book, I did an analysis of the Trilateral Commission, an organization founded by David Rockefeller back in the early 70s. And it's not difficult to see the influence that the Trilateral Commission had on U.S. presidential policy. This is very easy to see. Now, that's separate from UFOs. Within the UFO field, what we find are leaks upon more leaks upon more leaks upon more, describing how this problem has become privatized. That is, that fundamental control of policy on this matter has gravitated away from the office of the president. That doesn't mean that the president is irrelevant. It just means the president is a player, one of many, and probably not the most powerful of them. So, we've heard about a group called Majestic, or MJ-12. The question is, are they real? I think the answer to that is yes, they are real. Is Majestic 12 simply an American organization? I think the answer is no. So I think what we're dealing with relating to the UFO problem is most likely an international elite group of individuals who have most of the answers on this, answers at least that we don't have. They influence presidential and military policy to the extent that they need to. And I don't think that they're of a mind to want to share much of what they know with the rest of us. And the reason I don't think that they want to do that is because this is a secret that in fact has turned out to be very profitable for them. Imagine it this way. Pretend that you've recovered a piece of exotic technology not made by human hands. And so now you've got this and you have to decide, well, what do I do with this? Well, if you want to have it studied, you probably will need to send it off to some military contractor whose job it is to make things for the government. They have the R&D, they got the engineering, all the right people to do this. So it goes off into private industry. Well, who owns the private industry? It's those guys at the top, obviously, who then, over the years, exert near total or absolute total control over that artifact. And this is a goose that lays golden eggs for them. You study this piece of exotic technology long enough, you're going to get some neat ideas, aren't you? One of your genius scientists working for you will say, oh my God, well, I can't duplicate all of the electromagnetic properties of this thing, but we can approximate it, and here's some of the applications that can come out of it. So that, in other words, it's not that we can completely replicate a flying saucer that these aliens may have, but the fact is that seeing examples of their technology very likely would give human scientists in the covert world ideas for their own innovations and money-making opportunities. I think that's how it works. And so in that kind of a situation, those people who have control over this technology, they, as I see it, they have no incentive for sharing this. Why would they? There's no reason that they would want to. This is the foundation of a great deal of power and wealth for them. Regarding the issue of the moon, I recall, again, you know, it's funny how when we stay in this field long enough, how far down the path we go. There was a time when I used to just laugh at ideas. Oh yeah, well, there's a base on the moon. And I'm thinking, how is that even possible? Well, I still don't really know how it's possible, but the only thing that I'll say on that is I've talked to a number of individuals. I'm talking brilliant individuals with real credentials. They're real people. They're not fictitious people who are plugged into the national security community pretty well, who have said to me, for what it's worth, that yes, they are aware of bases on the far side of the moon. Now, one hears this in this field, believe it or not, one hears this a lot. There's no way I can prove this at this point. Really, all that it is a bunch of stories. I'm at the point where, although I could never openly say, yes, this is the case, it's one of those things where you have to collect the evidence and then maybe wait for the day when you can confirm or deny it. That's where I think I'm at in relation to the whole moon issue. One might ask the question, you know, in relation to using UFOs, let's say America has its own secret arsenal of UFOs, and you might say, well, but wouldn't they be handy as some kind of psychological weapon against the enemy? Wouldn't it be useful in stopping the hemorrhaging of money that has essentially bankrupted the United States? The two wars that U.S. is fighting simultaneously, Afghanistan and Iraq, let us face it, there's been no money for these wars. They have been major contributors to not just the American financial problem, but the global financial collapse. They have contributed. So you might think, my God, this UFO technology had better be damned important for it to justify the ruination of an entire national economy. The answer that I have with that is that, yes, those people running this secret, my feeling is that that is exactly what they believe. That the UFO, that's how important the UFO technology is to them. So yes, while it would be handy, while it could probably end the war in Iraq, if you had a flying saucer, all right, and it, used it, you could probably disable the whole army. Now, there's another scenario. Could you use that technology and pretend that it's alien, thereby keeping your own control over it secret? I think I guess that would be possible, but I think of that as a bit problematic, risky, all right? Because now you're making it very crystal clear that the aliens are on the side of America? Okay? Not everyone's going to buy that, or if they do, boy, that's bad news for a lot of people. So my feeling would be that even using it as a psychological weapon in that manner is a risky operation, and at a certain point, the cover is going to be blown on it. So my feeling is that the technology is considered just too vastly important to be used on mere conventional geopolitics, that this is being used in some way to deal with these others, off-world, in Earth orbit, maybe off-planet, maybe the moon. I don't know the answers to all of this. I can only speculate. If you consider that there are anomalies on Mars, which many people do believe, you might think that, well, if I want to investigate those Mars anomalies, I'm going to need a secret space fleet to do it. I can't exactly ask NASA to fund these missions, so you'd have to go deep black. And in that case, you would need a secret space fleet. There are a lot of reasons, as I see it, for wanting to have your own secret fleet of flying saucers, even if they don't help you win conventional wars. When asking about things like one world government, you can look at this issue totally separate from the UFO side of it. In fact, most writers on the New World Order don't really do much with the UFO issue. I don't think it's difficult to see that our entire global structure is moving toward a kind of global political system as well, a one world government, if you want to call it that. Yes, I don't think that's an argument that you can make anymore against. If you look at the long history of this development, go back to the 18th, 19th, and 20th centuries, and you see inextricably how the global economy has done this more and more and more. It's interlocked. A corporation can't be bound by national laws. I mean, let's face it, even in the mid-19th century, late 19th century, if you're Andrew Carnegie making steel, so you set up shop in Pennsylvania, but then you got to get all of your materials from around the world. Okay? You can't have big tariffs. That kind of ruins your business. It makes the product expensive and so on. Every corporation functions on that basis. Corporations can't be merely national entities. And so what has happened increasingly over the last 200 years with increasing speed is a movement by those people who are basically running the global economy to eliminate vestiges of national sovereignty, because all that does is it gets in the way of what they're trying to do. Now, you might say that's a good thing, you might say that's a bad thing. Either way, that's what's happening. And those guys, the leaders of finance, the leaders of industry, are the people who choose the political leaders. It's always been that way. And so what we've seen over the last century in particular is a very concerted movement toward, let's call it, a one world government, or now as former President George Bush Sr. used to call the New World Order. Yes, there's no question about this. That is where it's going. Real interesting question now is how does that tie into the UFO cover-up and the UFO reality? Now there's something to bend your mind around a little bit, okay? If they're moving toward a one world government, which I think that's right, are there those then who are equally cognizant of what's going on with non-human intelligences that are here interacting in some way with this planet? Is there a relationship there? I think the answer is yes. I can't prove that the answer is yes. I only think that it's yes because I see one big truth here, and I see another big truth here, and I have a very difficult time seeing how they could be completely separate forever. I can't see that. So I think that there's a relationship there. The UFO cover-up is, in other words, a key part of our world today, just as the movement toward a one-world government is a key part of our world today. I think future research in the nature of the cover-up has to move in that direction. It has to, in other words, understand what this relationship might be. That's really where the true research needs to go. In the book that I've just written, UFOs and the National Security State, Volume 2, I do try to explore some of these issues. But the fact is, what is needed is a large number of people pooling their resources and trying to get answers here. I mean, think about the state of UFO research today. Compare it to any field within academia. All right, we've done a great job as UFO researchers, considering the fact that we don't get an income for what we do. We don't have any institutional support to speak of. We're just out there on our own doing our thing. Whereas in the academic world, it's very different. You're able to devote yourself full time. You have a salary. You have grants to do research. That is what's really needed, because this problem is so complex. It's so big. It demands the resources necessary for a lot of people to go in. I don't pretend that my word is the final word. I'm trying to provide a good first word so that we can continue this conversation down the road. If we're talking about evidence of aliens, what we have to talk about are claims of aliens. I'm not sure if that counts as evidence, okay? However, let's say one thing about some of these claims. There are many of them. They come from a very wide range of sources. Many of them have a great amount of detail in them. And they're compelling. Not conclusive, they're compelling. So let's leave it at that. We have to be content with a little bit of uncertainty on this issue, I say. So if you take that, then yes, there's a wide number of sources that allege that there is alien interaction with the population of Earth. Now, I've often speculated that if I were an alien, and let's say I didn't look like a normal human, I still might want to interact with humanity for my own purposes, and I might genetically engineer my own humans, or I might take certain humans and tweak them and make them work for me, or, implants, who knows? There might be different ways of going about this, but the point is that I might want to have such humans working for me. And that would mean a certain level of infiltration. It might be benign, it might be malign. It could be anything. So to call it evidence, I think, is a stretch. But to call it a reasonable working hypothesis, I think, is correct. All right? And if I were not a scientist, but rather a counterintelligence expert, this would have to be one area that I would need to look into. In other words, a counterintelligence guy doesn't have the luxury of a scientist. Scientists can say, well, I need proof. I have to establish my protocols for testing this phenomenon, and until I get all the evidence, A, B, C, D, and everything lined up, then I can't possibly conclude that this is the case. Well, if you're doing counterintelligence, and if you're worried about the security of your society, you don't really have the luxury to afford that. You have to act, and you have to think, well, what is the likelihood of this happening? So it has to be a reasonable hypothesis, and I believe that is a hypothesis among those people in the intelligence community. Here's another reason the UFO topic might be of interest to just an ordinary person who's never given us a thread of thought in their life. And it's this. What if you've gone through your whole life thinking that your reality consisted of this, and this, of that ball game, your family, and some of your hobbies and recreations. And let's say this is how you see your life. Simple life, simple everything. The reality of the UFO phenomenon could very well transform what you think you even are as a human being. Because if, let's just say, you have the example of a non-human intelligence that's operating on levels beyond anything you imagined, intellectually, in terms of consciousness perhaps, what that means is that gives us an example of potentials that we may not have achieved ourselves. What I'm suggesting is that the UFO phenomenon can be a stimulus for an awakening, a discovery of who we actually are. And on an optimistic note, it might actually spur us into development as a species and as individuals to reach a much higher level of awareness of who we are than we'd ever thought possible before. That could be the upside, and I hope that that is the true side of what we're dealing with. There's a dark side to this, I believe, but there's, it's true that every crisis breeds an opportunity, and this crisis might bring us an opportunity for an awakening of who we are, rather than just, looking down at the ground and our feet in front of us and thinking this is our life, but it doesn't have to be like that. So, UFO phenomenon is one very excellent way to enable us to open our eyes and see who we really are and what our potential is. You can lead them through the media, through what you feed them through the media. You can lead them through the academic institutions. If you have key connections through the CIA to Harvard and to Yale and all the other big shots, you can manage the culture. And so people, look, we are living in 21st century America. We have certain beliefs that we hold. Had we been raised in 13th century Arabia, we'd have different beliefs, wouldn't we? Mean that we don't have some free will, but it does mean that we're very dominated by our culture. And so that culture, in our case, is very much a top-down culture these days. It's determined by corporate leadership, political leadership, and they decide largely what goes on the TV. They decide what gets into your head through mainstream media. So in other words, when you say that people don't care, I would say it's a little more involved than that. People have some free will, but they're also easily managed. Just like, I use an analogy in my first volume. It's like people aren't like a car that you drive. Not quite that simple. They're more like a horse that a good rider can manage. If you're a good enough rider, you can manage that horse. It has a will. You've got to be mindful of it. But if you know what you're doing, you can manage it. I think that's what the public is like. And these guys, they're expert riders.